A billionaire's mother disguises herself as a cleaner to test the women around her son. Who will treat her with kindness, and who will look down on her? As she silently observes, some fail the test, mocking and ignoring her. But one woman stands out. When the truth is revealed, the entire office is left speechless. Who will face the consequences? And who will earn a place in her son's life? A billionaire's mother walks into her son's company, not as a wealthy and powerful woman, but disguised as a humble cleaner. She moves quietly, unnoticed by those too busy to care, wiping floors and picking up after others. But she isn't here to clean. She's here to observe. Watching closely, she takes note of how the women around her behave when they think no one important is watching. Some ignore her, some treat her with indifference, and a few look down on her with outright disrespect. But one woman stands out, and what she does will change everything. Would you treat someone differently if you didn't know who they really were? That's exactly what happens here, and some people are about to regret their actions. Would you pass this test? Tell us in the comments and subscribe for more eye-opening stories. Because this isn't just about wealth. It's a test of true character, and only the deserving will come out on top. Margaret Sinclair had spent her life surrounded by luxury, but today she stood in the gleaming lobby of her son's corporate office dressed as a simple cleaner. Gone were the designer dresses and sparkling jewelry. Now she wore a plain brown dress, a headscarf neatly tied, and held a mop in her hands. She wasn't here for charity or curiosity. She was on a mission. As the mother of billionaire businessman Daniel Sinclair, Margaret had grown tired of watching women chase after her son for his wealth. She wanted to find someone who valued kindness over status, someone worthy of being by his side. And to do that, she had to see them as they truly were, when they believed no one important was watching. Daniel Sinclair was everything a businessman was expected to be. Sharp, driven, and impeccably put together. His success had made him one of the most sought-after bachelors. But that was exactly the problem. Women threw themselves at him, dazzled by his wealth, but their intentions were rarely pure. Daniel, unaware of his mother's secret plan, believed love would come when the time was right. But Margaret knew better. Love, the kind that lasted, wasn't built on bank accounts. It was built on respect, compassion, and genuine connection. The Sinclair Enterprises office was a sleek, modern space filled with professionals who thrived in a world of high stakes and endless ambition. Margaret moved through the hallways, mop bucket rolling beside her, blending into the background as if she belonged there. Employees rushed past her without a second glance. Some barely acknowledged her existence, too consumed by their phones or conversations to notice. Others gave her dismissive looks, their expressions making it clear that she was beneath them. As Margaret wiped down a counter near the break room, a group of well-dressed women stood nearby, their laughter sharp as they exchanged gossip. One of them, a tall woman in a fitted blazer, scoffed as she walked past, nearly knocking Margaret's mop over. "Watch where you put that thing," she muttered, not even sparing a glance before scrolling through her phone. Margaret said nothing, simply observing, making mental notes. But then something unexpected happened. As she bent down to pick up a cloth that had fallen from her cleaning cart, a soft voice spoke. "Here, let me help you." Margaret looked up to see a young woman kneeling beside her, handing her the cloth with a warm smile. Unlike the others, she wasn't rushing past or pretending not to see her. She treated Margaret with respect, not because she thought it would benefit her, but because it was simply the right thing to do. Margaret took the cloth and nodded, a knowing smile playing at her lips. She had found someone worth watching. Margaret moved silently through the office, her presence barely acknowledged by the well-dressed professionals around her. She had expected this. People rarely paid attention to those they believed were beneath them. As she wiped down desks and swept the pristine floors, she caught glimpses of the employees' true nature. Some walked past her without so much as a glance, their eyes fixed on their phones or conversations that seemed far too important to be interrupted by the sight of a cleaning lady. Others, however, made their opinions clear in different ways. "Ugh, can you not do that right now?" A sharp voice cut through the air. Margaret turned to see a woman in towering heels, frowning as she stepped back to avoid the mop. "You're getting water everywhere," she huffed, barely concealing her irritation. She didn't wait for a response before striding off, her dismissal clear. Margaret simply nodded and continued working, taking mental notes. She had encountered many like her before, people who believed that status determined worth. But she was here to find the exception. As she reached for a cloth that had fallen from her cart, another pair of hands beat her to it. "Here, let me help," a soft voice said. Margaret looked up to see Emily, a young employee with warm eyes and a kind smile, offering the cloth to her. Unlike the others, she didn't hesitate or look down on Margaret. Instead, she treated her like any other person. "Thank you, dear," Margaret said, accepting the cloth. Emily simply smiled. "It's nothing," she said, then hesitated before adding, "I know how hard you guys work. My mother used to clean offices when I was a kid." Margaret studied her closely, watching as Emily greeted a security guard by name and exchanged a few friendly words with a receptionist. She wasn't just kind to Margaret, she was kind to everyone, regardless of their position. But the test wasn't over yet. A few minutes later, Vanessa, one of the company's top executives, strolled into the break room holding a cup of coffee. She glanced at Margaret before smirking. With a deliberate flick of her wrist, she spilled the coffee onto the floor. "Oh no," she said, feigning innocence. "Guess you'll have to clean that up." She turned back to her phone, uninterested. Before Margaret could move, Emily stepped forward. "Let me help," she said, grabbing a napkin from the counter. Vanessa raised an eyebrow and let out a short laugh. "Why are you helping a janitor? That's literally her job." Margaret said nothing, keeping her expression neutral. She didn't need to speak. The test had already given her the answer she was looking for. One woman had revealed her heart through kindness and another through cruelty. The decision was becoming clearer by the second. The atmosphere in the office shifted the moment Daniel Sinclair walked in. The air, once filled with casual chatter and indifference, now buzzed with forced enthusiasm and sudden professionalism. Employees who had barely acknowledged Margaret moments ago were now standing taller, smoothing out their clothes and plastering on their best smiles. The same women who had looked through her as if she were invisible were now competing for Daniel's attention, eager to impress the billionaire CEO. Margaret observed quietly, taking in the hypocrisy. Just a few hours ago, they had treated her as nothing more than a nameless cleaner, unworthy of respect or even a second glance. Now, as they watched her standing beside Daniel, their expressions shifted from confusion to realization. They saw her not as the janitor they had ignored, but as someone important. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, Margaret removed her headscarf and straightened her posture. Gone was the humble cleaner. They were now looking at the elegant and powerful mother of their billionaire boss. The room fell into complete silence. Vanessa's smirk vanished, and the others around her stiffened, their faces turning pale. The weight of the moment hit them all at once. The woman they had belittled, dismissed, and mocked was the one person whose opinion mattered the most. Margaret let the silence linger, letting them feel the full impact of their actions before finally speaking. "I came here not to judge resumes, but hearts, and what I've seen is disappointing." Her voice was calm, but the authority behind it was undeniable. Daniel, still processing what was happening, turned to his mother. "Mom, what is this?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. Margaret gave him a knowing look. "You've spent years struggling to find someone who truly cares about you, not your wealth. I had to see for myself if there was anyone here who deserved to stand by your side." She glanced toward the employees, their forced smiles now replaced with anxious expressions. Daniel looked around the room, his sharp gaze taking in the sudden discomfort on their faces. And then his eyes landed on Emily, standing off to the side, her expression a mix of shock and confusion. Unlike the others, she wasn't squirming or making excuses, because she had nothing to hide. Margaret walked up to Emily, her face softening. "You treated me with kindness when you thought I was a nobody. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Emily swallowed, looking between Margaret and Daniel, still unsure how to react. "I was just being decent," she said hesitantly. Margaret smiled. "That's exactly the point, my dear. You didn't need a reason to be kind. You just were." A nervous laugh suddenly cut through the moment. Vanessa, desperate to salvage the situation, stepped forward. "Oh, come on," she said, her voice light but strained. "It was just a joke. I didn't mean anything by it." Margaret slowly turned to face her, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "A person's true character isn't revealed in grand gestures, Vanessa. It's revealed in the small, everyday moments when they think no one important is watching." Vanessa opened her mouth to argue, but one look from Margaret shut her down completely. The power dynamic had flipped entirely, and now she was the one standing powerless before the woman she had dismissed. Margaret stepped back beside Daniel, watching as the weight of the lesson settled over the room. Today, some had learned the hard way that money and status could be deceiving, but character never lies. Margaret let the silence settle for a moment before turning back to Emily, her expression warm yet decisive. "I would love for you to join me for dinner tonight," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "I believe you're someone worth getting to know." A collective gasp rippled through the office. Eyes widened, mouths slightly parted. No one had expected this. Just moments ago, many of them had dismissed Margaret as a mere cleaner, failing to see the test that had been unfolding right in front of them. And now, the woman they had ignored or mistreated was receiving a personal invitation from one of the most powerful women in the city. Vanessa's face paled, her fingers tightening around the phone she had been so absorbed in earlier. The other women who had rolled their eyes or avoided Margaret exchanged panicked glances, realizing too late what they had done. They had failed. Emily, still recovering from the shock, hesitated. "Dinner?" she repeated, almost unsure if she had heard correctly. Margaret smiled knowingly. "Yes, dear. Yes, I'd like to know more about the person who showed me kindness without expecting anything in return." As Emily slowly nodded, still processing everything, Daniel stepped forward. Unlike the others who had been trying to impress him all morning, Emily had never sought his attention. She hadn't even realized who he was, until now. He extended his hand. "I don't think we've officially met," he said with a charming smile. "I'm Daniel." Emily blinked before shaking his hand, offering him the same genuine smile she had given Margaret earlier. "Emily," she said simply, as if she were greeting any other colleague. Daniel studied her, intrigued. She wasn't flustered by his status or trying to impress him. She was just herself. And for the first time in a long time, that felt refreshing. Meanwhile, whispers filled the office as the truth spread like wildfire. Margaret Sinclair had secretly tested everyone, and only one had passed. Employees who had mocked or ignored her now stood in silent regret, realizing the opportunity they had lost forever. Emily, the woman they had barely noticed before, had just become the most important person in the room. Over the next few weeks, Daniel and Emily spent more time together, not because of wealth or status, but because of something far more meaningful: genuine connection. For Daniel, who had spent most of his life surrounded by people who saw him as a prize rather than a person, Emily was different. She wasn't trying to impress him, she wasn't drawn to his money, she was simply kind, thoughtful, and real. That alone made her stand out in a way no one else ever had. Emily, too, was learning more about the man behind the billionaire title. She had seen how the corporate world revolved around wealth and power, but Daniel was nothing like the arrogant executives she had worked under. He was humble, intelligent, and surprisingly down-to-earth, qualities she admired. Their conversations weren't about luxury, but about values, dreams, and the things that truly mattered. Back at the office, the lesson Margaret had imparted still lingered. The employees who had once laughed at her now avoided her gaze, fully aware of the mistake they had made. The story of Margaret's secret test had spread, and those who had failed it were left with nothing but regret. One afternoon, as she stood before the staff in her true form, not as a cleaner, but as Margaret Sinclair, a woman of wisdom and power, she delivered her final words. Wealth fades, titles mean nothing, but character, that lasts forever. The silence in the room was deafening. Vanessa and the other entitled employees lowered their heads, unable to meet her gaze. They had chosen status over kindness, and, in the end, it had cost them dearly. As Margaret turned to leave, she glanced at Emily and Daniel standing side by side, exchanging warm smiles. She had found someone truly worthy of her son, not because of riches, but because of who she was at heart. And as the two of them walked out together, it was clear that this wasn't the beginning of a fairy tale based on wealth. It was the start of something real, something built on respect, kindness, and love. You never know who you're talking to. Kindness costs nothing but means everything. Margaret Sinclair walked into that office as a simple cleaner, and in just a short time, she saw the true nature of those around her. Some failed the test, valuing status over decency, while one woman stood out simply by being genuine. Emily didn't know she was speaking to a billionaire's mother. She just chose to be kind because it was the right thing to do. And, in the end, that made all the difference. Would you have passed this test? Have you ever seen someone judged unfairly just because of their status? Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your experiences. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more powerful, eye-opening stories. because in the end, wealth can open doors, but only character can keep them open.